I found myself driving along 385 and River Road yesterday, going between, say, here in Athens and Catskill and Ravenna, and I was struck by what a beautiful August 31st it was. Not because of the sky, but because of the fields. I saw corn that was ready for picking. I saw pumpkins that were just about ripe and ready to go. I saw, let's say, a couple of small gardens that had looks like beans and peppers and squash, all kind of rounding in the shape, ready to be picked very soon. You know, the harvest is coming soon. And there's a phrase that was in our letter, our letter from James, saying, by the way, if you get a chance to, from home, read that letter from James. It's a very short letter in the New Testament, one of the shortest entries in the New Testament. And there's a couple of phrases in there that are just wonderful. They're on there. They should be on your scriptural highlights. One picks up stories about first fruits. One talks about, say, the idea that faith without works is dead. And the other one is, be doers of the word, not just hearers. Okay? 3 little James highlights for first thing in the morning. And I'm just reminded about that first fruits reference because that goes back to the Hebrew scriptures. It goes back to the days when the farmers of ancient Israel, who out of thanksgiving would take the first fruits from their harvest, they would go to the temple, or if they were near Jerusalem, they would go to the temple in Jerusalem, and they would bring their harvest. They would bring some of the best things from their field in that first pass through the harvest, and they would take them and they would offer them as a fiery holocaust to God in thanksgiving. Thanksgiving for the rains, thanksgiving for fertile seed, thanksgiving for a good harvest that would feed them and feed God's people. So that's a good thing to keep in mind. And in the midst of thinking about that, being fed, hey, that rings bells for us at this harvest time of the year. And, there's just some things I want to kind of just touch on a little bit, because in the midst of being fed, we are given strength and we can go forth to go and do God's work in the world. I'm reminded just from, don't ask me why, but I had a connection yesterday. I know sometimes people see the Coxsackie newspapers and the Ravenna newspapers. I try to stay up with those every now and then. And there was an article in the Ravenna newspaper 2 weekends ago. It was the August 22nd version, if you happen to come across that with the News Herald. There's this fellow there who writes a little column that kind of takes snippets from the paper like a long time ago. And he had one article in there that was talking about when a priest was first assigned to Ravenna in 1889. Okay? And they were talking about how up to that point in time, the priest from Coxsackie would come by horseback to support the people in Ravenna. Now, to me, it doesn't really matter whether, say, the priest was riding from Coxsackie to Ravenna to serve people, or the priest from Ravenna was riding to Coxsackie to serve people. But the idea that we are called to serve one another and be family together. Because that's kind of how the church grew. In the ancient days, in the generations after Christ, in the generations after, say, all those writers we have in the New Testament, Paul's writings in the 60s, Mark and Matthew in the late 60s, early 70s, Luke in the later 70s, John around 90 to 100. In those generations following them, the church kind of grew from Jerusalem area, and they kind of followed the coasts. Northern shore of Mediterranean, southern shore of Mediterranean. And then as the generations passed, they moved inland, okay? It took a couple hundred years for them, to get into southern France and upper Italy. It took them nearly 500-700 years to get into what we know today as Germany, in part because they were limited by the number of ministers they had. Okay? But passing on God's word. But you can see, let's say, how the church is kind of radiated out from the towns on the coast going inland. And why do I say that? That's how the church grew around here. Our diocese was formed in 1847. St. Mary's in Hudson was established in 1848. St. Mary's Coxsackie was established in 1854. St. Patrick's in Catskill, 1859. You see where I'm going with this? Now, what happened down around Catskill? Hey, a community in Cairo came up around 1880. Up around here, a community in Ravenna came in around 1889, 1890. See what I mean? Radiating out. That's how the church grew, in part limited by the number of ministers they had. And then I know many of you here, people who comb your hair like I do, you might remember there were lots of priests. And we have less of that now. We haven't always had a lot of priests. There were eras where we did not. Like those late 19th century stories when parishes supported each other. And the priests went from town to town by boat or by horseback to care for the people. Wasn't always there every week, but they cared for the people. And that's what was going on. So these are good things to kind of keep in mind. We take first fruits and we are nourished by the Lord and go to do the Lord's work. Now, when I mentioned, let's say that, that maybe there was a time when we didn't have a lot of priests, and maybe like in parts of the 20th century, we were a little richer with our priestly resources, and we did lots of different things, and now where things are going in society and people responding to God's call, that seems to be on the wane again. You might remember about, say, 8-10 years ago, the diocese had their Called by Name program where they invited people to think about who are, say, young men in their communities who might be open to an invitation to consider priesthood. Now, in a couple of months, we're going to talk about Called by Name for deacons. And with me, my time with you these last 3 years, I'm always going to be calling by name, looking for our lay ministers in different fields. These are all important things. But right now, a little focus on priesthood if I can. Can it be the focus of your prayer to think about, are there people we might invite by name to kind of come and listen, maybe come and discern that there might be people like me standing here maybe a generation from now, which is not a bad thought, because we want to kind of keep our parish communities going. Remember what Father Jay's talking about with our network? Try to keep the church alive in all the communities. Can we find ways to share our resources so that we serve all the people in all the locations to the best of our abilities? Might it look different in the future? You bet. But will there be a Catholic presence all through Ravenna and Greene County? Yes. That's what we're trying to do. So that's part of what we're doing with Called by Name. Now, the other thing I want to share with you is that, well, where did I come from on this? Because we're all called as priests to share our vocation story a little bit. I'm part of a family that went to church every weekend. My mom and dad went every week. We all went. There were 6 of us kids. And the interesting thing is that for me, the story is about serving the church. I was an altar server back in the day, like 60 years ago. For all those things that go on, I thought about priesthood when I was very young, but I went and worked for about 8-10 years. Then I went to seminary. And one of the things that caught my attention was following Jesus and service to people. When I worked in New York City, ample opportunity to see need for service for people. When I worked in San Jose, ample need to see service to people, things like that. So for me, walking with Jesus, serving his people, that's what moved me. And I think knowing many of you involved in parish ministries, that's what moved you too. So let's think a little bit about who we are as being people who are first fruit people who are fed by the Lord. Let us rejoice and be glad.